Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts. And every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot.
Welcome to Left of Black. My name is Anthony Neal, your host, and we are joined here today by Hank Willis Thomas, who is at Duke University to give the Rothschild Lecture at the Nasher Museum. How are you doing, Hank?
Oh, I'm great. It's great to be back.
Thanks for coming and joining us in the studio. Your lecture coincides with Southern Accent, which is the most recent show that's been curated by co-curated by Trevor Shoemaker. You have two pieces that were commissioned for Southern Accent. Ain't Nobody Gonna Turn Us Around, and also Black Righteous Space, which is an interactive piece, which is part of the exhibit. Talk a little bit about those two pieces, and particularly their relationship to Southern Accent. We could start with Ain't Nobody Gonna Turn Us Around, which of course uses kind of iconic photography in the civil rights movement.
Yeah, so the installation Ain't Gonna Let Nobody Turn Us Around is mirror collage. So there's mirror and photograph. And the photographs were taken by Spider Martin, who was a photojournalist in 1965 who documented the Selma to Montgomery March. And in the midst of that, we all know of the Bloody Sunday, March 7th, 1965, when several of the protesters were attacked by the police at the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And when you see this installation of about 17 pictures from that period, you see yourself in the mirrors. And it's really hard to explain, but hopefully it's really about the past and the present kind of meeting in the moment that you're experiencing the work.
What do you think it is about that particular moment with Selma? You know, this is right after, of course, Ava DuVernay's film depicting the events of that period. What is it, do you think, about Selma that continues to resonate, you know, in the American imagination, you know, both as kind of a cultural and a political event, but also in terms of an artistic moment?
Well, for one thing, I think it was a turning point in the civil rights movement. You know, it was after the March on Washington, after the Voting Rights Act, 1964, but it was also, I think, still in the midst of the struggle, right? And so I think it was such a clear example that we hadn't gotten to where we wanted to go yet. And the fact that in front of cameras, the police were so willing to be so brutal, yet again, almost 10 years after Birmingham, I think was such a really powerful and frustrating thing to witness. And so I think that also is something we're seeing again with police in front of cameras taking advantage of their power.
There's a way in which I think your work has anticipated a shift, particularly in the popular realm, to the visual. So much of it is about, of course, young folks having access to handheld cameras and being able to capture everything in Instagram and that whole kind of moment. But, you know, whereas 20 years ago we might have thought about Black culture's essence, if you will, being articulated in Black music. Clearly we're in a moment now where it's shifted to the visual. And in some cases, if we think about Beyonce's Lemonade, you know, a conversation between the visual and the musical. You know, what do you think about that shift? Do you agree that that's a shift that we're looking at? And how has it impacted this new moment of Black visual culture? How's it impacted your own practice as an artist?
Well, I think music spread faster and earlier because of technology. Radio was a technology that allowed people to have a discourse nationally and internationally with the music that people were producing in very local communities. And now with the internet and the advent of social media, we start to see the visual culture take a new stage to actually be much more present, because we're all constantly inundated with images and reading images, and now we can actually deal with conversations that might have only happened in art galleries and museums, but we start to see them in the public and on national and international news and television.
Speaking of music, recently Beyonce performed with the Dixie Chicks at the Country Music Awards. And I mention that juxtaposition because I think it speaks a great deal to the work that you do with Black Righteous Space, juxtaposing the Confederate flags in colors that resonate in terms of the Black Power movement and Black Pride. Talk a little bit about that installation and again, its relationship to Southern Accent.
Yeah, so Black Righteous Space, I don't know where the term comes from, but I first heard it in an Outkast song, I think on the Quemini album, where they say you're on that Black Righteous Space, it's blank. And this idea of a Black Righteous Space, I wondered where that term comes from, what does it mean? What does a Black Righteous Space look like? And I realized that it really is about this specific place to speak from in the United States and in the Caribbean that really is about being the descendants of slaves that were really the reason for our country's wealth and power, and and being left behind, but also being kind of the core of the soul of the country, this kind of very dignified and defiant position to speak from. How do you represent that? And so the Black Righteous Space installation, which is a combination of songs, speeches, and interviews featuring African Americans and Afro-Caribbeans, but speaking and singing from a place of defiance. And when they speak, this image of the Confederate flag that is normally red, white, and blue, but now it's red, black, and green, becomes distorted and turns into like a mandala or various other shapes whenever there is sound. And I think it's really about how we can use our voices to take symbols that are oppressive sometimes or disruptive and turn them into something else.
How has audience reaction been to this particular installation, particularly given all the controversy around Confederate flags post Charleston and everything else that's gone on in the last few years?
Well, it's so great to be in North Carolina at this time. This is, you know, North Carolina kind of feels like the center of the universe in a way. And I have, I think, 4 projects up. I have a project called Unbranded: A Century of White Women at the Weatherspoon. I have work in this Southern Accent show, as well as my Truth Booth project was at the North Carolina Museum of Art, and I have these benches that are there, and then our For Freedom Super PAC has projects at SICA. And I think for me, being able to be an artist working in a variety of mediums and approaching things from a variety of ways, but in this time, in this space, is really impactful. And then because people can respond to it not from this position, from that position, they have to respond from a multitude of positions. But Black Righteous Space specifically is a piece that I created in 2012, and now it's up. No one wanted to show it, but now it's finally up here. It's up at the California African American Museum in LA, and also at the Oakland Museum as part of the Black Panthers 50th anniversary exhibition. And each one of those playlists are different. This one is very Southern focused. One is kind of more, I think, about a more open kind of history or interpretation of Black Righteous Space, and the other one is really focusing on the Black Power movement. And so I'm really just amazed that a work that I thought no one really cared about
suddenly it's timely.
So that's, and maybe it's after, you know, Black Lives Matter that a piece like this becomes more relevant.
Well, let me ask you a very different question, because you mentioned that you have these playlists that are associated to these very different versions of the installations around the country. Do you listen to music when you work?
I don't listen to music when I work, but I think songs like Ain't Gonna Let Nobody Turn Us Around are very instrumental in their titles to the way that I think about, like as I said, Black Righteous Space. So this lyrics, I think, are very, very important to me, and I think because some of them are triggers. They're like a springboard. They force me to like, because they don't leave your head, right? So like, how do I, as a visual artist, how do I turn this into something else?
I saw you a few weeks ago in DC at the new Smithsonian Museum. What's been your general impressions so far at the new African American Museum?
Well, as I was saying, I moved to DC in 1992, 91, and because I didn't want to go to high school in New York. And my mother was hired in '92 to be a curator at what was then called the National African American Museum Project, by a woman named Claudine Brown, who was then the director. And now, almost 25 years later, that museum becomes a reality.
Actual museum,
for me, I can't speak about it from an objective position. It's just like realizing how much work goes into something. You know, I didn't really, you know, few people know that this was almost 3 decades of work by hundreds, if not thousands of people to make this museum a reality. And I think it's amazing. I mean, architecturally, I think the curatorially and installation-wise, it's amazing. You can't tell the whole totality of African American experience in one museum, and also I think it's important to realize that, you know, Black history is American history. The reality is the need of that museum comes more out of the fact that for most of the history of our country, African Americans have been written out. Right. So how do you got a building to write that, you know, but you can't just put us in the small corner of American History Museum when American history hasn't really been acknowledging.
Have you been surprised by the overwhelming excitement and support for the museum? I mean, that was the thing, the one time I was there, I mean, it was shocking to me. You know, it was a festive event, you know, it was a reception, so it had a different kind of energy anyway, but just simply the amount of people and hearing the stories of folks who wait online and buying tickets 4 and 5 months in advance, are you at all surprised by that excitement?
I'm more surprised by the famous and powerful people who can't get in. You'd be amazed how many people who are really successful, very wealthy, very distinguished, who ask me, can you get me in? I'm like, I tried 4 times and I think I got cut off. But so that says a lot, you know, that, you know, you got people like, how do I get into this museum? You know, this American History Museum. That's like, that, I don't know if any other American history museum has had that kind of experience.
You know, there's a way in which the museum, and even given the long time it took for it to launch, it's a model for how you raise money and bring together a kind of brain trust, you know, for this kind of national project. But there's so many local museums, right, in various regions that suffer, you know, for lack of financial support. Do you imagine, and I know you obviously hope, that some of this energy around the National Museum will trickle down to some of these more, you know, regional museums? I'm thinking about DeSable in Chicago, or the Lewis Museum in Baltimore as just 2 examples.
Right. I think that those museums do good and important work. Yeah. I think, however, their mandate and responsibility is different than the National Museum of African American History and Culture, because although up until then they actually had to try to speak to this, you know, major international history, I think now some of them can do more specific local work, and they have been beacons in the community, but hopefully we are not going to overwrite the complexity of African American history by just focusing on the stars and the famous people here and there. And what I love about going to certain more regional African American museums is I learn about people who, and stories and African American experiences that I never knew anything about before.
Very specific to those regions, those cities, those communities,
Right, but I think it does raise the bar, right? Yeah. And I think that's interesting. And also, I still haven't figured out how to feel and make sense of the controversy around Clarence Thomas. What do you think?
You know, I think you tell the story that needs to be told. I think about that in the context of, you know, Cornell's Hip Hop Archive, and they very publicly, you know, got the papers of Africa Bambaataa, and then all these stories, of course, come out recently about, you know, him perhaps sexually assaulting young boys. You know, do you now remove that project from the archive? Do you talk about his contributions to the culture and not talk about the difficulties? I mean, I think the challenge is you try to represent the complexity of the culture, you know, even if some of that, you know, complexity doesn't make us comfortable.
I mean, when you said that, it made me think about, you know, how Bill Cosby and what's happened with him. But then you think about who found it, who most of our streets are named after.
Right.
The rapists, you know,
Yeah.
the slave masters and exploiters.
Right.
And you can't ever kind of play down what Bill Cosby has done, or definitely has been
what he
accused
contributed,
of doing.
but also what he's contributed to the culture, what he's contributed even to the art world.
But realizing that you can be an awful person, but still do great things.
Right.
And if we're trying to find the ideal people to tell the ideal story, how do we tell a history, especially history as complex as African American history and culture?
Absolutely. One of your projects that has gotten wide visibility in the last couple of years is Question Bridge. Talk a little bit about the origins of that project and how successful it's become as kind of even a portal from, you know, folks who don't necessarily have a relationship with art. You know, Grant Hill was here a few weeks ago. Of course, he's an alum, a collector. He likes to describe it. He collects the classic African-American artists. But he took his collection on tour a few years ago, and he talked about how important it was that when they came to certain locales, that, you know, the public schools were open for kids to come through and see the art, and for many of them that would be the first time they had ever been in an art gallery. I imagine that Question Bridge has functioned the same way for audiences that don't normally think about art galleries or artwork, but because of the subject matter around black masculinity and everything that's gone on the last couple of years, you know, it brings particularly young men into those spaces.
Yeah, it's Question Bridge Black Males. It's a video-mediated megalogue between African American men. And it's a transmedia project, so it's a book, it's an art installation, it's a website, a mobile app. And when I first came down, and the first time I was ever on your show was when we were showing it,
doing a beta version of it here down at Duke.
As a beta version, work in progress. And so we've come a long way. We were at Sundance Film Festival. We've been about 50 museums and galleries around the country, and have had over 700,000 people go to see it and engage, and had over 1,000 or more participants. And so it's been pretty incredible to see how a project that starts off pretty humbly can grow into something pretty impactful.
I reference your work a lot in my own writing and in my teaching. And I'm
on the cover of one of your books.
Yes, you are. You're on the cover of Looking for Leroy. Thank you for that. I'm always apt to describe you as a conceptual artist. How do you describe yourself?
I like to describe myself as a person. Because, but the funny thing is people laugh, but I'm serious, you know, because we forget that the whole creation of Black identity was about dehumanizing us, right? And James Baldwin said, a person is more important than anything else. And I think the lack of personhood has very detrimental consequences to especially the lives of African American men. And so James Baldwin also said that an artist's struggle for their integrity should be considered a metaphor for the struggle that's universal and daily for all human beings to get to become human beings. So as an artist, I'm constantly trying to become and be a better person. And I think I can't extricate that self. So I say conceptual artist or photo conceptual artist, that doesn't mean anything to anybody. I'm a person, I hope one day will.
What's next for you, Hank?
What's next for me? I think I'm going to give a talk tonight at the Nasher Museum, and then, you know, I think we're. When is this going on air?
We don't know yet.
Okay. What's next for me is depending on who's president.
That will inspire the next round of art.
Of next round of personhood.
Yes. Well, thanks for coming and joining us today, Hank. We've been joined today by Hank Willis Thomas, person, conceptual artist. He is at Duke University to give the Rothschild Lecture at the National Museum. His work is featured in the Southern Accent Show, co-curated by Nasher curator Trevor Shoemaker. Thanks again for joining us, Hank.
Thank you. It's great to be back.
Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts, and every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black everything black, culture over everything, y'all. We taking running back.